Okay, you're all very welcome to this, the final lecture of the 2024 UCC Dante Public Lecture Series. And I'm really, truly delighted to welcome Professor Nick Havley as our final speaker this evening. Now, Nick, before I give him his proper introduction, has done the correct thing and has given us a handout. So that's circulating in the room here and also online. I believe Dario has put a link for those of you following us online, if you want to click on the link, and that will give you access to the handout there. There's also, in a shameless bid for self-promotion, a flyer for Nick's forthcoming book, which is for all of you there. And that's coming out very soon, and you're going to get a 30% discount if you use the code there. So please, after listening to tonight's lecture, I'm sure you're all going to want to read this, and I heartily recommend it. So, as I said, I am really, and there's a number of reasons why I'm really delighted that Nick is our final speaker. I've been trying to get him for years, and every time I write him, these are the dates, and it never quite coincided with what was going on in his life or the dates that we had available here. But Nick is one of those kind of very unique individuals in the world of Dante studies, Dante reception studies. Is a man who has worked across a broad range of areas in Dante and Dante reception studies, as I said, and he bit of a one-off, if you like, and he's done, and I think it's important to kind of state here, he's done tremendous work also for younger scholars and promoted their work and helped them and seen them through across the line in PhDs and with publications and things like that. So he's a genuine good man in that sense. So Nick is an emeritus professor of English and related literature at the University of York, and that's a wonderful title, English and Related Literature, because it allowed him to kind of develop and really hone in on Dante studies as this related literature. And I think in many senses, it's something that perhaps once you get into Dante tends to take over as such. One of his first major Dante publications is this wonderful volume with Cambridge University Press, Dante and the Franciscans, and that was back in 2004. And recent publications include Dante, one of the kind of Blackwell Guides to Literature, Dante's British Public, Readers and Texts from the 14th Century to the Present, and that was with Oxford University Press in 2014. This very important volume that I have on my shelf at home, Dante Beyond Borders, Context and Reception, and that's from 2001. It's edited with Jonathan Katz and Richard Cooper. And I think it would be remiss of me not to mention this wonderful volume that he did with our very own Bernard O'Donoghue. This is After Dante, Poets in Purgatory, and it grouped together a series of contemporary poets, Irish, some of them, but we have Lorna Goodson there as well, the Caribbean poet, Mary Jo Bang, the American poet, who have all contributed to translating a canto of the Purgatory each, or in some cases a few cantos. And it really is a splendid volume because, as you know, the Purgatorio is the canticle in which Dante, more than anywhere else, encounters other poets and talks about poetry. So I think this is a wonderful volume. Nick has received Leverhulme and Bogliasco fellowships and was also elected an honorary member of the Dante Society of America. So he has this kind of vast range of interests. However, it's a very curious thing that when I contacted Nick, and I was expecting something along these lines, and he says, okay, I'm going to offer up a paper on Dante and mountains and 19th century travelers. And this, I believe, forms the basis of the book which we're publicizing with you, that's coming out in, is it March or May? May. So there's going to be a particular Dante focus to it as well, which we're going to hear. We're going to get to be the first ones to hear about this evening. So will you please join me in welcoming Professor Nick Havley. Just a little bit of that, and
Okay. Make sure to stand in the right place to hopefully to catch the microphone better. Well, thanks very much, Darryl, both for that introduction and for inviting me here. I mean, it's good to be in Cork. It's the hometown or home place of my friend Bernard O'Donoghue. And also, I believe the great expert on slow Irish airs, the former Dean of Engineering, Thomas O'Conning, a great musician, and it inspired me today to buy a tin whistle. Okay, which I won't play now. I'm sure Thomas O'Conning would turn in his grave if he heard me. Okay, this lecture is about places and responses to them. So, in a way, Dara, as editor of essays on actual and imagined places and spaces in Dante and his life and work, would be much more qualified on this subject, at least from the Dantean point of view. I'll have a bit to say about Dante's actual mountains, but I'm going to be mainly concerned with some later writers' attitudes towards them, and how they came to see and imagine the mountains that are associated with Dante. Okay, I'll begin then with a peak that Dante actually mentions several times, and I can advance on this, can I? Yeah, here we are, yes. In other words, and I took this, oh, I can use that as well.
That should go up.
Sorry?
No, it's okay.
Yeah, okay, yeah, right. Right. This is I think this is my own photograph, actually. Yes, it is, because I took it on the summit of Falterona. But as I'm sure you'll know, this is a mountain that's actually mentioned by Dante as the source of the Arno in the beginning of Purgatorio 14, and he mentions it also he had already mentioned it in the Convivio. Okay. So I begin with a little bit about those Dante placing himself in these mountains. His journeys in the Tuscan Apennines have left visible traces in the rather scant records of his life, or Dante's life, and also traces in his work itself, and, as I'll try to show, at many points in the reception of his work during the long 19th century. Here we have another place near the mountains, because the earliest evidence locating the poet as wanderer in banishment is a document of June 1302, listing those present at a meeting of political exiles from Florence in the Abbey Church of San Godenzo, some 50 kilometers northeast of Florence, and close to one of the main passes of the Apennines, the Muraglione Pass, where I got lost at one stage. Whilst a report based on a local chronicle then places him just across the ridge at Forlì, perhaps as an emissary of the same political faction, the Guelph Whites, the Bianchi, at the Ordelaffi court in the autumn of that year, 1302. So by the time Dante began writing the Commedia 5 or 6 years later, he had traveled widely between northern Tuscany and the Lombard plain, And an early work of his exile, the De Vulgari Eloquentia, of eloquence in the vernacular, imagines the Apennines as a significant watershed in Dante's linguistic map of Italy. And this is passage 1 in the handout. Right, and here it is on screen. This idea of the Apennines as a kind of roof of Italy from which water flows down to the opposite shores of the Tyrrhenian and the Adriatic. Okay, and here just to remind you of what that backbone of Italy looks like. This is the map of the Apennines as they stretch from the northern, the Settentrionale section, which is the one I'm mainly concerned with, down to the central Apennines and further south and on indeed into Sicily. So during this and later stages of his wanderings, Dante must have actually crossed what he calls the leafy shoulders of the mountains a number of times, with all the challenges and risks that medieval travel in such rugged terrain would have carried. As a number of later writers have claimed, the physical and mental stress of straying from the right path amid the densely forested valleys and ridges of the higher Tuscan Apennines may well have informed the confusion and panic that beset Dante's fictional pilgrim between the dark wood and the mountain in Inferno's first canto. Conversely, to think of an occasion in the mountains which is less stressful, the reader is invited to imagine in Purgatorio the moment of relief as thick mist lifts off the mountains. This is passage 2. Ricorditi l'etor semai nell'Alpe, ti colse nebbia, per lo qual vedessi non altrimenti che per pelle talpi. And then when the vapors disperse, how you begin to see the sun. Now, Alpe, no, semai nell'Alpe. Alpe here and elsewhere in Dante doesn't mean Alps necessarily. It's a generic term for mountainous country. And it survives as such in dialect and place names in the Apennines, like San Benedetto in Alpe, Alpe di Catenaia, etc. Whilst in Dante and his Tuscan contemporaries, Alpe applies particularly to the Apennines, to the Apennini. Several sources, documentary sources, dated shortly before or during the composition of the Commedia, placed Dante among the Tuscan Apennines and in locations that several of his works would specifically evoke. 2 documents of October 1306 mention Dante Alighieri of Florence as a representative, a negotiator of the Malaspina family in their negotiations with a local bishop about control of castles in the Lunigiana. And Dante's hosts and employers in this case held territory there, and the Marchese Moroello, who was one of the Malaspina family, was politically and militarily prominent figure whose family had castles at various places in the Lunigiana mountains. And in the circle of the thieves in Inferno 20, the end of Inferno 24, Dante encounters a Pistoian thief called Vanni Fucci, who rejoices prophetically and maliciously in Moroello Malaspina's imminent defeat of Dante's erstwhile allies in Pistoia. Vanni Fucci imagines the Marchese Moroello as a force of nature in 1302, descending, this will be 2 years, of course, after the fictional date of the Commedia, descending upon Pistoia to attack Dante's political allies from his stronghold in the savage peaks of the Apuane. And here is this is passage 3 in the handout, Vanni Fucci's speech about Moroello Malaspina as this kind of force of nature, like coming out of the Val di Magra, So sort of coming out of the mountains like a thunderstorm. Now, as well as acting as a negotiator for that baronial family of the Malaspina, Dante would also reply on Moroella's behalf to a sonnet from a Tuscan poet, Cino da Pistoia. And around 1308, Dante would send Moroella Malaspina a letter and a major poem, the so-called Canzone Montanina, which the letter speaks of Dante having left the Malaspina court. You know, he's now in the Casentino, some distance away over to the east, whereas the Malaspina castles are up in the west, and as I say, in the hills of the Apuane, and he describes himself in the Casentino as being in mezzo l'Alpi, again using the word Alpi, you know, to mean the mountains referring to the mountains of the Apennines, and more specifically being also in the upper valley of the Arno, which flows down from those mountains, which indicates, therefore, he's further east in the Casentino, where he would return again after 1308. He would come back he'd be there in 1311, since he writes one of his political letters, two of his political letters, as he says, below the springs of the Arno, because the source of the Arno is below Monte Falterona in the Casentino. So both the Casentino and the Lunigiana are named and evoked in the Commedia. The landscapes of the Casentino are an especially powerful presence in simile, myth, and memory throughout Dante's poem. The thundering waterfall of Acquaceta in Inferno 16, the streams flowing down above Romena, the raging torrent of the Arciano, which is a tributary of the Arno in Purgatorio 5, the serpent-like crawl of the Arno itself as it emerges from below Monte Falterona in beginning of Purgatorio 14, and of course, amongst the sacred places, La Verna, the rough rock between Tiber and Arno, which was the mountainous site of St. Francis's stigmatization, and to which I will later return when I speak about visitors there. And we should not forget that at a key moment at the end of the Purgatorio, there is an extended simile when Dante is in dire trouble with Beatrice. We see him, the penitent Dante, dissolving into tears of contrition, which is described through an extended simile as like the melting of long frozen snow on the branches of pines on the ridge of the Apennines. This is the passage, si come neve tra le vive travi per lo dosso d'Italia. See, the Apennines are referred to here as the backbone or the back of Italy. Right, okay. And the branches here are actually interestingly spoken of as in Francesco, this late 14th century vernacular commentary by Francesco da Bucci, mentions them as living beam, speaks of the living beams of Vive Trave, a reminder, because they were going to be used kind of proleptically, describes them as material for construction, which was indeed the case. I mean, the pines of the Apennines were vital material for construction for cities like Florence and Rome. Indeed, the whole area around the Bocca Trabaria, which is one of the passes which is a pass between San Sepolcro and Urbino, still reflects that name, Trabi, and the area is called the Massa Trabaria. So, despite the uncertainty and paucity of information on his whereabouts during much of his exile, Dante is known to have been present at certain places in the Apennine landscape, and that landscape and the physicality and symbolism of mountains in general continued to be a significant feature in his work, especially in the Commedia. Now, turning to that presence and those features as they were seen by later readers and writers, a notable aspect of the cult of Dante in the 19th century is the urge to trace and dwell upon the footsteps of Dante in the Italian landscape, including the Tuscan Apennines. This reflects in part the development of bourgeois tourism in this period, and also what has been called, in an interesting book by a guy called Paul Westover, necromanticism. The subtitle of the book is Traveling to Meet the Dead. There came to be an increasing interest in viewing these the landscapes of Italy through Dante, and placing the poet memorially within locations such as the Casentino and the Lunigiana, particularly. British journals and memoirs and guidebooks, for example, began to populate the key sites in Italy with references to and quotations from Dante, and these include places in the Apennines. An early and influential example was the Scottish schoolmaster Joseph Forsyth, who published remarks in 1813, published remarks on antiquities, arts, and letters during an excursion in Italy in the years 1802 to 1803. This was a highly influential guidebook. And throughout this account of his Italian travels, Forsyth shows a detailed knowledge of Dante's Commedia and quotes from it frequently. He even seems to have been the first to use the adjective Dantesque in English. If you look at the OED, he's actually the first source to be listed there. Forsyth's travels in Tuscany took place near the start of his long Italian tour in the spring of 1802. And his account of the Apennine stages of the journey focuses chiefly on Camaldoli and Laverna, as the second and third of the sites which were called the sites called the three sanctuaries of Tuscany. The third one was one a bit further away from the Apennines, namely Vallombrosa. But Forsyth certainly visited Camaldoli and Laverna, and he invokes Dante at several points. He cites the Paradiso in epigraphs to his chapters on Camaldoli and Laverna, and he also quotes the words of the Inferno's Maestro Adamo, evoking the hills of the Casentino. And as he moves on, as Forsyth moves on through the Arno Valley, he speaks about deforestation of the Apennines and harks back to the lush landscape that Maestro Adamo had evoked. And he speaks of how the soil was loosened from the roots and washed down by the torrents, and then quotes Maestro Adamo, who is suffering from dire thirst in in Inferno 30, and amongst the forgers and falsifiers, gli uccelletti che dei verdi colli del Casentin discendono giusto in Arno, facendo I lor canali e freddi e molli. So Forsyth's local encounters with this particular dead poet Dante formed an important precedent for other 19th century travelers and travel writers, and had some effect on the quite prolific subgenre of works that dealt with Dantean topography. Now, some writers and travelers in the 19th century followed Dante's path quite literally into the Italian mountains. In 1882, an article called Notes on Old Tracks, The Mountains of Dante, was published in the British Alpine Journal by a distinguished mountaineer, Douglas Freshfield, who had climbed Mont Blanc while still a schoolboy and would become president of the British Alpine Club. And Freshfield argued that the Florentine poet, quote, knew how to climb, end of quote, although he argues that it is the cornice paths leading to upland meadows in the Alps rather than the Apennines that are, quote, surely the source of the scenery in Dante's Purgatory. Shortly afterwards, however, his argument was disputed by an Italian climber, journalist and guidebook writer, Ottone Brentari, because in 1887, Brentari published a long essay in the Bollettino del Club Alpino Italiano under the somewhat bracing title of Dante Alpinista. Against Freshfield's claims about Dante in the Alps, Brentari insisted that the poet's main mountaineering experience was in the Tuscan Apennines, as well as in the Alpi Apuane and in the Lunigiana. And this is, he then says, that they were the mountains most often closely encountered and traveled are the Apennines and equally the Apuan Alps and the mountains of Liguria. Without doubt, Dante climbed up to the peaks of Valterona, from where his view extended over the whole of the Arno Valley. However, in Brentari's opinion, the poet, quote, was not a strong climber, since on the evidence of his performance when climbing Mount Purgatory, he shows himself, quote, often tired and exhausted, di frequente stanco ed affaticato. Now, by the time that these guys were writing about the poet as mountaineer, the fashion for following in the footsteps of Dante was very well developed. These guys were writing in the 1880s. Much earlier in the century, the French philologist Jean-Jacques Ampère had presented Dante as a guide to Italy and Italian landscapes as a potential commentary on Dante. So Ampère's book, The Voyage Dantesque, was first published in 1839. It subsequently appeared in German and Italian translations, and its approach can be illustrated by the author's account of ascending Monte Falterona one early morning. And here is a translation, my translation of that passage where Ampère describes an ascent of Monte Falterona and imagining Dante traveling with his guide by the light of the stars, open to the impressions yielded by harsh and barren landscapes, steep tracks, deep valleys, and all the travails of a long and burdensome journey. Impressions which were all to be reflected in his poem. So, and Ampère's itinerary in the Voyage Dantesque and his placing of Dante firmly upon such peaks would be enthusiastically followed by a number of later literary guides. A further word, meanwhile, about this whole urge to place Dante within a landscape. Will Bowers has recently written an article on visitors to Vallombrosa. And here he argues that following the footsteps of poets and conjuring up physical and psychic sensations are particularly powerful aspects of 19th century literary tourism in a culture that was, I quote from Will Bowers, increasingly interested in the lives of dead authors and driven by an urge to commune with the ideal authorial presence at a related physical site. And you can see, I think, from Ampère's, the paragraph of Ampère's Voyage Dantesque, this is an obvious example of and a spur to such communing. It was a highly popular guide to the physical sites at which Dante's presence could be imagined. It appeared in several versions, as I've said, Italian, German, and Italian. And one early version would be described by a skeptical British scholar of the time as, quote, but superficial and occasionally incorrect. And that skeptical British scholar was a little known figure who features in my Apennine Crossings book, because his work has so far not been published. He was a Suffolk squire and a traveller, Captain Francis Brooke, who travelled across Europe and into Asia Minor, and whose travel journals are in 10 volumes, 10 big volumes in the British Library. During 1840s, Italy was one of Captain Brooke's favoured European destinations. And like many travellers, he spent time among the British community in Florence. He corresponded with the expatriate Anglo-Fiorentini, as they were called, and he came to know the eccentric doyen Seymour Kirkup, the collector and artist and discoverer of one of the discoverers of the supposed Giotto portrait of Dante in the Bargello, which that occurred during the 1840s. Francis Brooke also knew and corresponded with a number of other British Dante scholars resident or visiting in Florence. And for example, his scholarship was respected greatly by Henry Clark Barlow, one of the leading British Dantisti of the 19th century, and there are letters that exist exchanged between them. And as early as 1842, Brooke was recording details of early Dante editions, and the point that brings us to the mountains, visiting places that bore Dantean associations in the Lunigiana and in the Casentino. For example, when crossing on his way from Genoa to Florence, through the mountainous valley of the Magra near Sarzana, he recalls Dante's association with the Malaspina family. 2 years later, in 1844, Brooke also pursued Dante into the Apennines further east. His visit to the Casentino during the first half of May in 1844 took him to Laverna and Camaldoli, and his journey, Captain Brooke's journey, was planned, executed, and recorded with military precision. And here is the map that he drew of the area, pasted onto a sheet in one of his travel journals, a cloth map marking routes through places familiar to the traveller. The itinerary is drawn in blue, including places with links to Dante across the ridge of to the source of the Arno, Monte Falterona, San Godenzo, the waterfall of Acquaceta. And his eagerness to pursue Dante in this quite remote region, as it was then, is reflected by his introduction to the Casentino at the start of that volume of his travels, where he speaks of there is no part of Tuscany which, to the admirer of Dante, presents so many objects of interest as the Casentino. And then he refers to a number of the people the sources who have already written about it. And he said, Vallombrosa is a very common excursion with the English, but Bagno San Benedetto, which means San Benedetto in Alpe, and San Godenzo are entirely beyond the usual beat. So it's quite an adventurous journey. And indeed, his expedition led him in search of luoghi danteschi in the upper valley of the Arno. In May of 1844, he went on horseback with a guide from Stia up to the Capo d'Arno, the source of the Arno, and then on to the summit of Falterona, which of course Ampere says Dante must have climbed. He then wanted to see the waterfall of Acquaceta as described in Canto 16 of the Inferno, but on the way down from Falterona, he and his guide got lost in the snow and had to spend a night far on the other side of the Apennines before they found the famous cascades. And I can sympathize with that, having got lost at that very point myself. And here is a sketch, Brooke's sketch of the waterfall of Acquaceta. Now, Dante's Apennine footprints continued to engage the imaginations of travelers and writers during the later 19th and early 20th century. And now we can turn briefly to an Italian writer, a local in the Casentino, a guy called Carlo Beni, who published his Guida Illustrata del Casentino in 1881. And it was a substantial work that would go through 3 editions in the later part of the century. He was the mayor, the sindaco of his native town, Stia, a lawyer, naturalist, and travel writer. And he shows awareness of those who, from Ampere onwards, had traced Dante's presence in the Casentino's mountains. He cites Dante frequently, and not surprisingly, the Commedia looms large in his accounts of locations in the Casentino, such as Romena, Poppi, Camaldoli, and Laverna. And following Ampere and Brentari, he insists that Dante's mountains are primarily the Apennines, and that it is, quote, beyond doubt that Dante climbed to the peak of Falterona. But not everyone agreed. And indeed, strong doubts on the subject would be forcefully expressed by a late 19th century German critic and translator, Alfred Bassermann, who is still quoted in works on Dante, in Dante's locations. Bassermann was a very well-qualified Dantista who was actually engaged in translating the whole of the Commedia into German Terza Rima. And in 1897, he published a survey whose title made him seem to be following in the usual tracks, but he was in fact considerably more skeptical than Ampere was. And his folio volume, which is called Dante's Tracks in Italy, Travels and Researches, derived from, indeed, quite on-the-spot research, close attention to Dante's presence in the visual arts, and featured a large number of illustrations from manuscripts. In his chapter on the Arno Valley, Bassermann took issue with people like Beni and Ampere and Brentari on the subject of Dante as Alpinista, and expressed serious doubts about Dante's supposed ascent of Monte Falterona, concluding that his Ampere's assertion that Dante was surveying the whole of the Arno from one viewpoint, and thus providing a view that corresponded to Canto 14 of the Purgatorio, is not sustainable. Dante's footsteps do not lead us to the summit of Falterona. Bassermann's tracing of Dante's footprints endowed his work with considerable authority. He was familiar with the documents relating to Dante's exile, and key questions in his introduction are, I quote, "What basis does the poetry have in reality? What has actually been experienced?" And so that then leads him not only to the major Italian cities, but to remoter locations such as the Casentino and the Lunigiana and the Apennine passes, those regions occupying complete chapters in his book. And he gives really detailed accounts of the Apennine landscapes alongside passages from the Commedia translated into German Terza Rima. And this was reprinted in a small portable volume, presumably with the idea of providing a guide for Dante pilgrims, because it has a map conveniently slotted inside the back cover. And he continued in that edition to emphasize how firmly and quote, "how firmly and deeply the arcane poet of the afterlife struck his roots in reality, and how he drew from that his greatest energy." And indeed, in the later 20th century, Bassermann's survey continued to be regarded, and I quote an article from the August Encyclopedia Dantesca as, quote, "the best guide for many Dantean pilgrimages." So Dante's pilgrimages in the Apennines were also in the mind of several British writers in the region in this later part of the 19th century. For example, Ella Noyes published the first English guidebook to the Casentino with watercolors and line drawings by her sister. And she's following again in the footsteps of Ampère, placing Dante firmly within the region's landscape, insisting on features of that landscape as sources for the Commedia. Noyes' account of the procession of pilgrims to the rock of San Francesco at Laverna includes among those pilgrims, I quote, a certain sad wanderer in the valley below, namely Dante. And this is how she describes Dante around, passing by the rough rock of between Tiber and Arno, on which Laverna stands. The following chapter of her story of the Casentino even goes on to portray one of the hills in the upper Arno Valley as a model for Dante's Mount Purgatory, the, quote, figure of the toilsome Mount of Repentance up which it behoved him to struggle, whilst the poet's painful progress, imagined painful progress up the cliffs and steeps of hell and purgatory, has in it, quote, the remembered anguish of many an arduous climb in the Apennines. My final follower of Dante during this long 19th century is perhaps appropriately another Italian. In the years shortly before the Great War, a troubled young poet was wandering the mountains, the Apennine Mountains, above his native village of Maradi in the Lamone Valley, between Faenza and the ridge of the Apennines. Dino Campana, who lived from 1885 to 1931, had already for about 5 years experienced the bouts of mental illness that would recur until his death. But his energetic mountaineering in the Apennines provided some form of therapy, it seems, as did his reading of Dante. And Campana accurately describes Monte Falterona, we come back to it again, near the beginning of one of his journeys, as like a green and silver solemn gloom surging up like a huge petrified wave, followed by a long parade of fissures or layers, screpolature. Near the end of one long excursion below Monte Falterona, Campana spends the night in a wood, and here he invokes Dante as the poet of pilgrimage. This is passage 11 in the handout, and here it is. He's resting in the solitude of the forest. Dante and his poetry of movement, this is an interesting way of describing, all resurface in my memory. O pilgrim, pilgrims, you who walk deep in thought. And he associates Dante, exile, poetic composition with walking. Pellegrino evokes the wider idea of pilgrimage. The term, of course, occurs especially during the ascent of the mountain in Purgatorio, whilst Pellegrini che pensosi andate directly quotes the opening line of a sonnet addressing Florentine pilgrims and commemorating Beatrice near the end of the Vita Nuova. Campana's allusion here occurs during the account of his 1910 autumn pilgrimage from his hometown of Maradi to the Franciscan sanctuary of Laverna. And there on the Crudo Sasso between Tiber and Arno, he will also recall Dante. He arrives at Laverna, looking at seeing the columns of rock rising to a summit, grey in the dusk and enclosed all about by dark forest. Climbing up the mountain, he finds a correlative for his own troubled life in the huge rocks that near the summit of Monte Penna that heave up towards the sky, and the clefts where, as he says, a small stone staircase vanishes into immemorial darkness. Then from a chapel high on the mountain, he witnesses the fading of day over the Casentino and the fading of his own vision. This is handout passage 12. no, fuori il tramonto s'intorbida. Outside the sunset clouds over ominous grey streets, so on. Far away, those mystic and warlike sentinels, the castles of the Casentino, are seen slowly sinking into darkness. He then descends to the deserted terrace in front of the church and sits on the parapet watching the torch-bearing friars taking leave of the pilgrims to La Verna. And he feels, but does not hear, a breath of wind from the deep woods and the caverns above. And un alito continuo e leggero soffia della selva in alto, continual breath of wind, breathing from above. Una campana della chiesetta francescana tintinna nella tristezza del chiostro, e pare il giorno dall'ombra, il giorno pianier che si muore. He hears the chapel bell resounding in the gloom of the cloister, a bell that sounds like his other self and is indeed a melancholy pun on his own name, Campana. The words also of another wandering poet are heard too on La Verna's rough rock. The convent's bell rings tintinna, as did the one that is heard very shortly before Dante's canto of St. Francis in the Paradiso, tintin suonando. Yet the modern poet hears it more somberly, as if it stood by daylight beset by shadows, and like the, quote, distant ringing, squilla di lontano, that Dante imagines being heard on the first evening of a pilgrimage, the opening of Canto 8, famously imitated by Thomas Gray. It seems, for Campana, the bell seems to lament the dying day, il giorno pianier che si muore. As a very brief conclusion, I'd just like to take up a shrewd question that was answered, that was put to me by a colleague when I gave a version, a guy called Marco Canani, a romanticist, when I gave a version of a paper at the University of Chieti. Marco then asked whether there might be perhaps some form of connection between 19th century views of Dante's mountains and Italian nationalism. The association of Dante with the movement to and beyond national unification through the century, the Risorgimento, is well known from Mazzini, for example. It forms part, for instance, of the important research that's being conducted at the moment by Tristan Kay at the University of Bristol on the broader identification of the poet with Italian nationalism from the 19th century to the present, an identification that could have been reinforced by the association of Dante with spectacular features of the Italian man-made and natural landscape. For example, Carlo Beni, who I've mentioned as the author of the Guide to the Casentino in the 1880s, dedicated his guide to Queen Margherita of Savoy, describing her as, quote, devoted investigator of Dante's story, of the glories of Italy's past, and of the mountains. As well as being dedicatee of the famous pizza, Queen Margherita climbed to the 4,000-meter alpine hut named after her, and was also a founding patron of the Casa di Dante in Rome. And just one final example of this kind of association between Dante, the mountains, and the nation could be drawn from the end of the long 19th century, the eve of the First World War. From the imagery of one of the most successful movies of early Italian cinema. The Milano Films version of Dante's Inferno was produced at a time when cinema in Italy could be seen as, in several respects, a major national concern, because it was released in March and April of 1911, designed to coincide with the Jubilee commemorating the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Kingdom of Italy. It was publicized and reviewed as reflecting the spirit of our nation, our progress, a contribution towards unity, modernity, and the creation of Italians that Massimo d'Azeglio had called for. The Milano Inferno sought to achieve this end, partly by placing its protagonist within the landscape of Italy's mountains. Several of the sequences, indeed, were shot out of doors in outdoor locations, such as the Grigna Meridionale range above the southeastern branch of Lake Como. And here we have the two actors in those mountains. He's placing the entrance to hell in these mountains. So this is from the Milano Films version of Inferno 2, the entrance into the Inferno. And those playing the lead roles of Dante and Virgil have been described as, quote, obscure actors, but certainly good mountaineers. And perhaps most notably and controversially in this context, the film's final shot was of the recently erected Dante monument at Trento, which I think Anna Pegoretti has spoken about. With you can just about here see the outline of the mountains behind the monument, and this image of the national poet in the midst of what was still part of Italy's unredeemed borderlands, still occupied by Austria-Hungary, drew enthusiastic applause from the film's first audiences. But it was potentially, in 1911, potentially embarrassing for a government that was still committed to the Triple Alliance with Austria-Hungary. In the months before Italy's decision to enter the Great War on the opposite side, he left it until 1915, it seems that the Italian censors in 1911 were attempting to suppress the image of the national poet pointing aggressively towards the Alps and the Brenner Pass. And the shot is indeed missing from one of the surviving prints of the film. The significance of that Trento monument had already been articulated at the time of its inauguration by a poem that Anna Pegoretti has quoted, the poem by Giosuè Carducci, Per il monumento di Dante a Trento. This is just a reminder, that's the end of towards the end of the poem, which concludes by envisaging how the poet's spirit, before taking its stand and quoting, quote, waiting at Trento, had wandered for, quote, over 500 years along the rugged ramparts of the Alps. And then to take us just to the eve of the Great War, an august Italian cultural organization would also get in on this particular form of the nationalist act. The Società Nazionale Dante Alighieri, founded in 1889, had given its patronage to the Milano Inferno in various forms. And on the outbreak of the war, Società would support the war effort and the struggle for the terre irredenti by, amongst other things, publishing postcards featuring the Trento monument. And even before that, its 1913 Congress on Lake Lago Maggiore at the foot of the Alps would be published on a poster, which, as you can see, quotes the Paradiso on celestial peace, but actually presents Dante literally wrapped quite threateningly almost in the national flag against a background of somber alpine crags. I have a whole lot more images of Dantean mountains from the 14th century onwards, but I'll leave you with this one now, one which not only points forward to nationalistic conscriptions of the poet, but also draws upon some of the 19th century associations of Dante with Italy's mountains. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if you are interested in Dante and nationalism, we are actually doing a roundtable on it at the Society for Italian Studies conference in Royal Holloway. In next, when is it? June? June. Myself and Tristan and a number of people here. So yeah, it is very much a hot topic. Thank you, Nick. That was really, really splendid. I mean, that was a tour de force going from Dante right into the 19th century and then touching on the kind of early 20th century national appropriation of Dante. What's your own? I mean, you were very good on kind of, you know, unearthing what everyone else said about Dante Alpinista, but what's your own particular take on it? And what did mountain climbing and walking and excursions mean to someone in the 14th century?
Well, of course, medieval. We tend to think of the medievals as sort of rather sedentary or not going places. But of course, if you read a book like like The Medieval Traveller, I mean, they did they got around a hell of a lot, and clearly, Dante as exile must have have crossed those that ridge, the Humeri frondiferi, as he calls them, the leafy shoulders of the Apennines, and of course this comes back in some recent fictions. I think that there's that kind of Da Vinci Code type of Dante, breaking a Dante code, but I think it's rather better than the Da Vinci Code. Francesco Fioretti's Il Libro Segreto di Dante, whose protagonist is a medic and a kind of investigator. He hopes to meet Dante, but Dante is dead by the time he gets to Bologna. But it begins with a scene of crossing the Apennines, which is more or less a kind of a riff on Inferno 1, on the confusions and struggles of getting lost, in the dark wood and trying to climb the mountain. So I think it's clearly. What form of travel he would have used? Presumably horseback, but
to a certain point.
Yes,
I mean, I think and the dangers and the risks inherent in it, obviously. Not just bumping into the wrong sort of people, but with various beasts of various kinds. So we're going to open it up for questions here. We've got in the audience, and of course, if you're online and you'd like to ask a question, just put up your hand on the function there. Everyone's been very, very quiet today. Chiara Valcelli is going to start us off. So Chiara, will you come up here and talk so that the microphone can at least detect you?
Yeah, thank you so much for the lecture. I have actually two questions. The first is we talked about before the 11th canto of Paradiso. And as you know, Dante refers to real mountains several times, like for example, Il Colle Eletto del Beato Baldo, there is Monte Engino in Gubbio, there are also Fertile Costa d'Alto Monte Pen, there is Monte Subasio in Assisi. And I was wondering do you know if there are documented evidence that Dante visited that places in Umbria, or maybe it's just, I don't know, he invented, he knew, but...
Yes, interesting point. Yes, I don't know of documentary evidence, but there seems to be quite a sort of degree of familiarity with the places in that landscape. Interestingly, he speaks, as you said, Fertile Costa dell'Alto Monte is where that relates to Francesco St. Francis's birthplace, it's as if he's associating mountains one of the ways in which he associates mountains is with in Paradiso is with a kind of fertility, the origin, because actually Peter Damian, who comes from a mountain further south, Monte Catria, he refers to, and I'm not sure the commentators don't seem to point to the connection. He says these mountains used to yield fertilely. He speaks of the idea of hermitages as generating spirituality. And so he sees the mountains as a kind of a source of, in those two quite important instances in Paradiso, in Canto 11 and Canto 21, as a source of power and energy. And I think some of the illustrators seem to respond to that. I think Giovanni Di Paolo's illustrations of, he doesn't, interesting, Giovanni di Paolo doesn't illustrate the stigmatization, because of course it'd been done by Giotto and a lot of other people, you know, but he does illustrate the renunciation with the mountains and a stream in the background. So I think there's, you know, there's that sense of whether he knew those places or not. No, I think they have a certain, the mountainous landscape has a kind of power for him as a source of kind of latent or even patent energy. No.
Okay, yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
In fact, yeah, my second question is also related to the symbolic meaning of the mountain.
Yeah,
no?
absolutely.
And
yes,
I was wondering, maybe we know that, for example, in Purgatorio, the mountain has the meaning of rebirth, purification. And I was thinking of Ulysses, Joyce's Ulysses. As you know, in Circe, the Circe episode, the 15 episodes, the episode recalls maybe the infernal atmosphere with the voices, a lot of characters, and the night atmosphere. But at the end, there is this sentence by Bloom, and he said that he need mountain air. I don't know if you remember, I need mountain air. And so I was wondering, and I was wondering, is maybe this need of Bloom could relate it maybe to a need of purification, rebirth. I don't know, just maybe an idea, because I was thinking of the infernal atmosphere of Circe, the night and the brother and everything. And so I said maybe at the end could be this meaning that Bloom needs maybe like purification or something like that. I don't know, it's just...
Well, if Bloom is maybe one of the avatars of Dante's Ulysses, you know, that would be a rather bad thing to be saying, because I mean, you know, Ulysses sees the mountain, but it's the mountain that sends the breath of the whirlwind out to sink his ship. You know? So, but I wonder if I need mountain. Maybe to do with all this kind of smells of Dublin and so on. But but that's interesting. But I mean there is of course, I mean, when we speak of the Mount Purgatory, you know, I mean, this is the kind of ultimate kind of symbolic mountain, but it's also quite a real mountain as well, because he constantly refers to mountain land, you know, he refers to mountain landscapes in relation to Purgatory, and it's quite conceivable that when he was writing most of Purgatorio, he was in the Casentino. There is that, and there's that sense of, I mean, it all goes back to Jacques Le Goff, is, you know, of course, the birth of Purgatory, spends quite a lot of time talking about the nature of mountains, the biblical mountains, you know, in the Old Testament and the New Testament, of course, as, you know, sources of power. There's also the narrative of Dante, near Dante's own time, of the Sacrum Commercium, which is a Franciscan text which speaks of climbing the mountain, you know, St. Francis and his companions climbing the mountain to see Lady Poverty, who's up at the top, just as Beatrice is up at the top of Dante's mountain. So I mean, there's that highly symbolic aspect, but there's also the physical sense of effort, you know, particularly, and even sense of achievement. I mean, he says, you know, it's nice to be able to look down, you know, which is quite, you know,
but there is also sense, you know, when you do go up a mountain, you still have to come down the mountain, and the Inferno is all about the descents.
Particularly in Inferno 24, you know, where we have this sort of climbing up the mountain.
Comment there from Cormac: the dangers and pains of struggling up a real mountain or sliding down a crevice in hell form a strong contrast with the innocent looking Dilettoso Monte or some like Colle of Inferno 1. Is the message here that climbing out of the dark wood isn't as simple as it looks? Flying won't work around, so there, only paradise can we glide upwards. So that's from Cormac, if you want to.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Right, yes.
Yeah, well, you can think about that one. We also have a question from Enrica. Enrica, do you want to unmute yourself there?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Hello. First of all, thank you so very much for the very interesting lecture and for presenting such interesting materials. I study 19th century stuff as well, and have quite a taste for Dante reception as too. So I was wondering, what do you think is the role of Dante in shaping and fostering the 19th century taste for Italian landscape in particular, within the English public, and in particular in reference to sublime landscape? I don't know if the question is clear.
Yeah, this is very clear, and I'm not an expert on this, but I think one of the important sources would be part 3 of Ruskin's Modern Painters, and in fact I suspect that that's a source for people who say Dante was a bad climber, because Ruskin makes this point about Dante getting, constantly tired. But I think if you look at, I expect that it's a whole chapter on medieval mountains, and I think that's where Dante comes to play quite a large part in this, in those who are discussing the imagining of mountains in both in the Middle Ages and looking at them as they are at present. I don't know whether that is part of your area of interest.
It is, yes. Thank you very much.
Ruskin would be a key figure there. It's part 3 of Modern Painters. But yeah, I mean, I think also the idea of doing illustrations as well. I mean, in illustrations of landscape, Captain Brooke is not a terrific artist, but there were others who were quite keen on providing illustrations. There's in my book on Dante's British Public, I mention, I don't know if you've seen these, they're only available, I made I had some illustrations made for the book from Isabella MacLeod's collection of Dante illustrations, which are in the National Library in Edinburgh. Do you know those?
No, I don't, but I'll definitely have a look.
Yeah, I mean, because they reflect, I think, this idea of going to places and sort of bringing the poet to life through the landscape. And her daughters, and one of her daughters is quite a competent landscape artist, and so is her son. Her son did a rather fine illustration of the Camaldoli Valley. So that's all. Isabella MacLeod was part of this expatriate Anglo-Fiorentini circle. And so she knew people like Lord Vernon and Seymour Kirkup, and so that's another example, I think, of how the Dante gets associated with landscape. I mean, she includes a lot of other material besides landscapes, coats of arms and so on. But that's I think quite another important source. But do you have any other suggestions about the imagining of Dante's landscape in visual? This is through visual art, or people talking about the visual appearance of landscapes?
It was both, because I didn't yet pay much attention to this issue. I worked on other issue of Dante reception, and I work on visual culture at the turn of the 19th century, but also always in relation to literature. Currently, I'm working on Giacomo Leopardi's and visual culture, so something different. But I think that the impact that Dante has in Italian, but also abroad, on visuality in literature, and particular also in representing landscape and evoking images is striking and very important at the turn of the 19th century. So I was wondering what was the case for landscape in particular.
Yeah, yes. I think there's more to be said about placing Dante within the landscape, but it's part of this idea of traveling, this necromanticism, traveling to meet the dead, embody also the idea, the urge to embody Dante is to sort of placing him within a landscape.
There you are, Enrique. Yes, good to see you. Thank you for that. Okay, we have a question from Kenneth Clark.
Thanks very much.
Hello, Kenneth.
Greetings.
Good to see another Yorkie.
That was terrific and very rich and so resonant in so many different directions. And I have loads of questions, but I'll ask for just one. I was very struck by how often the questions about Dante and place was whether he was really there or not, whether he really experienced it or not. And I'm kind of wondering whether those kinds of inquiries can be traced alongside quite similar kind of literary critical engagements with the poem, which is, what is the status of allegory? Is this real or is this metaphorical? What is this journey? Is it a real? Does Dante really think he was there, or does he know he wasn't there and it's poetry? But I'm particularly struck by Basserman and that question of poetry and reality, because it seems that actually this is a very kind of rich confluence of questions about what poetry can do and maybe, what mountains can do as well.
Yes, so I think that the idea that idea, was he really there, sort of is a kind of reflection of Dante's own insistence, about being there, having been there. The fiction that is not a fiction, as someone said, Singleton. But yes, and there's also that kind of sort of interaction between the supposed real experience and its symbolism, which sort of also, I think, finds some resonance in the famous Petrarch letter about climbing Mont Ventoux. He claims this was around 1326, but the letter is considerably later. And whether he ever did it or not, I mean, he speaks of the and of course, he was not climbing it for the view anyway. He's climbing it for the wonderful coincidence of opening a copy of St. Augustine and saying, finding a passage which says, people are keen on, going to these strange places, but they don't look at their own. They're not looking at their own souls or in their own lives. So. I mean, he creates some sense of the difficulty of climbing, but on the other hand, that difficulty is mainly pointing towards the fact that he's following his brother Gerardo, whose nimbleness is actually not just physical nimbleness, but symbolizes Gerardo's speedier spiritual progression. So I don't know whether that sort of responds in a way to your question, but I think that I think there is a sort of a response in this. Was Dante really there? It's a response to something that is in the poem, which sort of makes these claims about being physically there.
Thanks for that, Kenneth. Well, we have time for one more question. I can see Julia, you have your hand up there.
Yes. In a dream, we mix together real landscapes with imaginary ones, which I think Dante does. I loved the volume by Vittorio Alinari, where he actually photographed the places that Dante mentions in sepia. And also, I've been playing with the idea of the mountain which Dante sees as both Monte Cecere, before the English planted all of the cypresses, when it was galleries for the quarrying of the Pietra Serena that built Florence, as well as John Desmarais' concept that it mirrors with the same galleries and gates and so forth, Monte Sinai, which I actually climbed in order to experience that. I loved your lecture, Nicholas, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Yes.
Okay, well, that is more of a comment than a question. Thank you for that, Juliet. That is great. Thank you. So, before we leave Nick off the hook, I just want to say a couple of things, because as you know, today, this evening is the very final lecture of the series. So, a number of people I want to thank. First of all, I want to thank my colleagues in the Department of Italian for their support, and in particular, I want to single out Marco Amici. Marco every year helps me design the poster, choose the color, and it's a very important thing because we do plaster it around the place in Cork, and especially here in UCC. So I like to thank Marco for his help and his indulgence on these things. I especially want to thank Leonor as well, because Leonor behind the scenes has been helping us out on an admin level, getting people over, getting them places to stay and things like that. These are really, really important roles, and I want to thank Leonor publicly for all that she does quietly, and she doesn't get praised enough. So thank you, Leonor. I really, really do appreciate it. I want to thank CASILAC, which is the Centre for Advanced Studies in Languages and Cultures, who generously fund us. I say generously, they fund us. They could be more generous, but they're generous. And I hope they will continue. They don't watch this recording. And it's very important because obviously these things cannot happen in a vacuum, and we do need the kind of funding to keep them going. And as we've said before, this is our 14th year of these Dante lectures, and it's really, and I'm really grateful to them and all the colleagues in the School of Languages, Literatures and Cultures. Also, the Society for Italian Studies have always, throughout the years, have been a great help to us. I want to in particular also thank my colleagues in the Centre for Dante Studies here in Ireland, in particular, the co-directors Federica Coluzzi, Valentina Mele, and Aista Kirstanoviciute, and most especially our PhD cohort, who really do, they come to all of the lectures, they ask all the serious questions, the good questions, and shows that they are listening better than anyone else. So I want to thank Alcina Caponetti, Chiara Valcelli, Bruna Lorenzini, who is with us for the year, and it's been a real joy to have Bruna here at all of our lectures. But most especially, I want to thank the person who isn't here this evening, is watching from Ravenna, that's Dario Galassini, who is our kind of technical maestro and who kind of makes sure that the right people get into these lectures and the wrong people stay out, and much else besides. And Dario is in the writing up stage of his PhD over the next coming months, and I really genuinely hope that he will be able to give one of the Dante lectures this time next year. So that's a kind of putting down a marker there for Dario. I want to thank our 5 wonderful speakers. It seems like such a long time ago that we had Francisco Meyer over here talking about Dante and justice, and then we had Anna Pegoretti, who Nick very kindly mentioned, to give a wonderful lecture on the Dante monument and the kind of the meanings of those kind of commemorative blocks. Matthew Chahern was there a few weeks ago talking about Dante and finance, and last week we had Serena Vandy talking to us about beginnings and endings. And then I thought we had this wonderful lecture this evening from Nick, and I thought it was really, really splendid and so rich. So I want to thank them all. I most especially, though, want to thank our audience, both our online audience, who are great supporters of the series and ask very cool questions, but most especially the people who come here into UCC on a Monday evening. We took a tremendous hit during the COVID pandemic, and it was really hard to build our audience back. We used to do these in lecture theatres. So the very fact that you come in on a Monday really means something to us, and I genuinely want to thank you all for coming in. I see so many familiar faces in the room this evening, and I really genuinely I just want to thank you for coming in, because it really means everything. Otherwise, why are we doing this? And we, you know, when the word public in our public lecture series is the most important word, I think, and we want you to come back next year. And I promise you that the next year's series is going to be even better. I have a list of names I can't reveal. I mentioned Dario, but there will be 4 others as well, and it will be a great series. As is customary, on the final evening of the Dante lecture series, we take the speaker to the Abbey Tavern for pizza and a pint, but you're all very welcome to join us. So please come along and don't feel like you can't come along. Please join us for just a small drink and a bit of pizza. We hope to see you down there. But please, before we go this evening, can you join me in thanking once again Nick for a wonderful, wonderful lecture. Thank you. And we'll see you next year.
Thank you. Yes, that's.
Ciao, Dad. Ciao.
Ciao, grazie Nick. Ciao Sara, ciao Corinna.
Tutti, ciao. Grazie, grazie.